We had been looking at some 25-pounder guns behind the British front line in France. It was a cold, rainy, dispiriting walk across boggy fields to our objectives and back. Where our cars were pulled up by the roadside stood a little cafe. Somebody said, "Fellows, let's go in here and get some hot coffee before we start back to town." The motion was carried with an amendment that we add brandy to the coffee. We trooped in through the cafe room with its bar and Madame the proprietress, and Madame the proprietress showed us into the family sitting room. While we waited for coffee we looked at the photographs on the wall, typical of any little French provincial home. There were pictures of Monsieur and Madame, apparently taken on their wedding day, a number of family groups, and the inevitable colored print, a souvenir of Paris. The door opened and a British officer, who knew we were there, came in. He told us that General Lord Gort, British Commander-in-Chief, was expected any moment to inspect the guns we had just visited. With luck, we might be able to speak to him. While we were debating this possibility, the door opened again. 2 more British officers entered. One we did not recognize. The other was Major General His Royal Highness the Duke of Gloucester. He came in with his boots about as muddy as ours, for he too had been making a round of the guns. But he looked hard and fit and younger than he appears in most of his photographs. There were introductions and handshaking all round. Then a short silence while the Duke took stock of 8 American correspondents, and 8 American correspondents took a good look at the Duke. Then the Duke eased the situation by pulling out a cigarette, and we all lighted up. Someone made a wisecrack, and things became still easier. Our first question was, naturally, when and where will the war on land begin in earnest? The Duke answered with a smile, "That depends a great deal on Hitler." There followed a general back-and-forth conversation about various aspects of the military situation in general, and the British position in particular, which was so confidential that I'm not going to let even the censors know about it. The Duke told us in reply to a question that he had seen his eldest brother, the Duke of Windsor, twice since the latter had donned British uniform and taken up a staff position. The Duke of Gloucester himself is chief liaison officer at British GHQ in France. His job is to maintain personal contact between General Lord Gort and the latter's staff on one side and the various army units in the British military sector on the other. If you drive around the British zone often enough, you are apt any day to meet up with a big, fast English car in which you can see the Duke driving himself on some one of the many journeys between headquarters and the various military positions. The Duke expressed his pleasure at the spirit displayed by the men in the British Army out here. He, probably more than any of the other staff officers, is in the best position to judge this spirit, for he spends most of the day driving about from one unit to another, watching tank maneuvers, inspecting armored car detachments, looking at gun positions, noting the progress being made on the trench lines, and all the time talking to the officers and men with whom he comes in contact. His natural, easy, simple, straightforward manner, which we met with in our talk with him, has enabled him to gain the confidence and understanding of the British Tommies out here. He spoke to us of the curious situation of the present military inactivity and seemed to agree with a laugh when someone pulled the gag that Hitler's secret and terrible weapon, which the latter mentioned in his Danzig speech, was merely boredom. The meeting broke up. There was more handshaking, a chorus from us of thank you and goodbye, sir, and the Duke was off again on his round of duties. And now for some fighting news. The British forces in the British sector in France has had its first encounter with the enemy. The fighting took place in the air. Result, one German plane brought down by a British pilot behind the British lines. The second enemy machine believed to have retreated over neutral Belgium, where it is possible that it crashed. There were no casualties to British airmen or machines, and no bombs were dropped. The raid warning sounded here one sunny morning. British planes soared up to meet the Germans. British pilots flying deadly single-seater fighters were concerned in attacking the 2 German planes which appeared a moment later. One of the latter was a twin-engined Heinkel bomber. The British fighters immediately went after him. The German at first appeared either to ignore or to be unconscious of the pursuit and continued flying a straight course. But as the British planes drew into machine gun range, the German gunner in the rear cockpit opened fire on them. Either his shooting was poor or the distance was too great, for he did no damage to the oncoming British. The latter held their fire until within effective killing range. Then one of the British pilots opened up with his machine guns. Smoke began to stream back from the German plane. One propeller slowed up, the machine gun firing ceased, and the enemy machine's landing wheels came down. The British plane started to spiral down. The British pilot ceased firing. The enemy plane landed in a field, hopped a couple of ditches, and crashed into a hedge. The pilot was uninjured, but the two members of his crew were badly hurt and taken to a French hospital. Another British pilot followed the second German plane for miles before the two machines opened fire on each other. The German's aim went wide of the mark, but the British pilot pumped machine gun bullets into his enemy, and a few minutes later saw the German plane nosedive with a cloud of smoke trailing behind him. The German machine which came down carried no bombs, so it was presumably on a reconnaissance flight. On the shelf of the fuselage was found the crew's rations, ham sandwiches, and chocolate. The victorious British pilot later called on his unwounded German opponent, who was only 19. So much for fighting in the air. Shortly afterward, I saw the ground end of that kind of show. I was standing in the middle of an anti-aircraft battery position somewhere in the British Army zone. Suddenly, someone shouted plane. A whistle blew, and the crews rushed to their guns. A moment later, the height finder crew were onto the distant plane and sang out the heights to the guns. In a split second, one of the predictor crew called out a series of numbers to the gun layers, which gave them the rough elevation and traverse. A moment more, and the gun layers had synchronized their dial pointers. Meanwhile, beside each open gun breech stood the loader, shell in hand, waiting to ram it home. The fuse had already been set. Just when I expected to hear the battery roar into action, the commander called out, "Stand at ease," and I knew there was no air raid. For by that time, the approaching plane had been identified as a British machine attached to an airdrome in the British sector. It was aloft, presumably, to test the effectiveness of the ground camouflage of various British positions in the neighborhood. But the moral of the alarm was that British anti-aircraft batteries must be constantly on the alert. Every approaching plane is theoretically an enemy machine, and the necessary defense measures must be taken until its identity is established. Within the next 15 or 20 minutes, there were two more such alarms, both of which ended as peacefully. The other moral of the alarm was that one of the battery officers said to me, "The next time you'd better jump into a trench. It might be the real thing." The layout of these anti-aircraft battery positions follows about the same pattern. The guns are sunk in camouflage pits. Nearby are the directing instruments. One is the height finder, which looks like the more familiar longitudinal rangefinder. Another is that marvelous precision instrument of applied mathematics, the predictor. It automatically works out the direction and speed of the approaching plane, incorporates the height given by the height finder, makes the necessary calculations for the effect of wind deflection on the anti-aircraft shells, and finally combines all these calculations into determining the point at which the shell and the plane should meet, assuming that the plane continues on a straight course. The latter, the plane must do if it is engaged in bombing or aerial map making. All the gun layers have to do is to make their respective movable pointers coincide with the figures calculated by the predictor. The battery position also includes protected trenches and dugouts for the personnel of the battery who may be in reserve or off duty during an action. And they are used, for soldiers are not allowed to engage in sightseeing when shells begin to fly. On the way back to the battery headquarters, I passed the air raid dugouts for the headquarters personnel. Over the main entrance was a painted sign, one of those jokes which the British soldier insists on making in war or peace. It paraphrased that good old London Cockney ejaculation, "Gor blimey," and read, "Gort blimey." Incidentally, the name of the British commander-in-chief figures prominently in a little verse which has spread throughout the British Army zone. It goes, "Whether your life will be long or short depends a lot on General Gort." Thank you and good night.
We return you now to America.